The death of the followers of Jesus demonstrates the truthfulness of Christianity, whereas the death and suffering of Jews somehow shows the wrongfulness of Judaism. I hope you got that. And those of you who are or were ever Christians, no, I'm not making this up. But the death and suffering of Jews at the hands of Christians, which is the ultimate mind-blowing chutzpah, that demonstrates the wrongfulness of Judaism. I rest my case.
So we're going to take this first call. Call your live on the air. Please tell us your name and where you're calling from.
Same kind. I'm questioning that in a previous episode, Rabbi mentioned that Paul was actually very pro-Rome. I understand the fact that he was an assimilated and very Hellenized Jew, but how could he have been very pro-Rome when ultimately it was the Romans that executed him? Correct me if I'm wrong, but beheading does not tend to promote friendship. I've always been perplexed by that. I don't see how that translates into Paul being pro-Roman. Thank you very much, Rabbi Tovia.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think it was the last show we talked about that the New Testament, or let's just say 26 out of the 27 books in the Christian Bible, with the very notable exception of the book of Revelation, is very pro-Roman. The Gospels are very pro-Roman, constantly seeking to exonerate the empire and hold the Jews uniquely culpable for Jesus' crucifixion. The Gospels, throughout the letters of Paul, especially in Romans chapter 13, Paul opens by saying that every person should be subject to the governing authorities. And I pointed out that in Paul's view, that people should be loyal to the empire, to those who are governing, is not because it's pragmatic, not because you don't want to get killed. No, Paul makes the outrageous claim that, in fact, this authority that's in place, in this case the empire, is there because it was established by God. Moreover, if you go to the second verse, Paul exhorts his readers, no one should ever resist or oppose this ordinance of God. Do not rebel against Rome. And get this one, because if you're rebelling against Rome, you're in essence rebelling against God. And your question is, well, if Paul was so pro-Roman, why would he be so pro-Roman if he was beheaded by the empire under Nero? I mean, so I know what some viewers are probably going, well, by the time he got beheaded, it was too late to change what he wrote. But in reality, that wouldn't be that's not the real answer. The real answer is the notion that Paul was beheaded by Rome is complete nonsense. It's an invention of the church, and it's mentioned nowhere in the Christian Bible, and it ought to be. The church would go on to invent the idea that essentially everybody was murdered, everyone died as a martyr, with the exception of John, the author of the putative author of the fourth gospel. The reason why the church had to claim that John, the son of Zebedee, who the church insists wrote the book of John, he didn't. And the book of John doesn't claim that it was written by John. But the reason is that everyone knew that John is written at the end of the first century, so you had to live really a very, very long time. But again, how many times have I stood with Christians who asked the question, why would the disciples willingly die for what they knew to be a lie? If you encounter Christians, this is going to come up very quickly. Like, why would Peter willingly be executed, crucified, not just crucified, but crucified upside down, because he didn't feel worthy to be crucified as his Lord? Why would Paul be willing to be beheaded if he invented the religion? If your life is threatened and you know you're lying and you didn't have an encounter with the Christ on a road to Damascus, when at the end you would go, actually, I made it all up, and I'll be glad to recant that because it's nonsense. The answer is that this is all nonsense. It's nowhere in the Christian Bible, and very importantly, in the book of Acts, where we're told that Paul was a citizen of Rome. How does the book of Acts end? The book of Acts, which is devoted to Paul, ends with Paul being freed from prison. Now, this is very striking, because if Paul was executed, was beheaded, as legend goes, and his head bounced 3 times, and each time it bounced, a spring shot out of the ground. And you can visit this church in Rome. It's there, spring and fountain and all. If Paul was executed, he would have been executed, we're told, by Nero, who was the bad guy. The reason why Christians think that Nero is a bad guy is a different story, and there actually is evidence for it that Nero did execute Christians. But there's no evidence for this at all. But if he did execute him, he would have been executed in, let's say, 64? When was the book of Acts written? The book of Acts is written, I'm being very conservative here, let's say 85, okay? That's very conservative. I'm being very charitable. But let's just do that. Let's steelman this, okay? So the book of Acts is written essentially 2 decades after Paul's supposed execution. And the author of the book of Acts didn't think Paul's willingness to die violently for his faith, that wasn't worth placing in the storyline? I think not. I think all this stuff is all made up. It's not in the New Testament. And what's very striking, I find, is that when I speak to Christians and they're seeking to explain to me why I should believe in Jesus, they actually use Paul's martyrdom and Peter's martyrdom as evidence for why I should become a Christian, because why would they die willingly? And then I ask them, I can't tell you how many times this has occurred. Where does it say that Paul willingly died for his religion, that he was beheaded in Rome? And Christians earnestly look at me in bewilderment and disbelief, and with confidence, they open up their leather-bound Bible and are spinning through pages, and I'm just standing there and watching them. They're like looking for where it says that Peter was executed by Rome, and after about a minute of this, as they're going through pages, I tell them it isn't there. I mean, I don't want to mock them by letting them go on and on and on. So I tell them it's not there. That's a Roman Catholic tradition. You know, I'm not a fan of the Roman Catholic Church, but Catholic apologists who argue that Protestants are borrowing all this Catholic tradition while giving lip service to sola scriptura, these Catholic apologists are right. The Protestants kept all the good stuff. These are all Roman Catholic traditions that the Protestants accepted because they like them. So there's nothing in the Christian Bible about Paul willingly dying for his religion. Do not come to me and say you can't prove from silence. Okay, you can't. You can't use that. If Paul was executed, the book of Acts would have recorded it. That would be very important. It's a later Christian invention. And particularly the author of the book of Luke is really into martyrdom and telling you how to die for your religion. The idea that he died willingly, this is all a part of Christian Roman Catholic folklore that's invented, and Everybody ate the stuff. Mary was killed. Everybody killed. I have to pull this one little piece here. I have to add this because if I didn't, I'd be remiss. I always wanted to say this. I don't know if I ever said this. Christians sometimes, when they're fiercely arguing for their religion and the wrongfulness of the Jewish faith and the wrongfulness of the Jewish people, will argue, why does the Jews suffer so much? Have you not heard this? Like, why are the Jews persecuted wherever they go? Maybe, like, Jews are getting killed all over the place. Maybe it's the fault of the Jews. Maybe because they rejected Christ. Listen very carefully, because if you've never heard this before, you've been living under a rock. Missionaries frequently argue that the Jews suffer and die because we killed Christ, because we are opposed to the Son of God, because we rejected the Messiah. Worse than rejected him, we killed him, right? So the Jews suffer. Why do the Jews suffer so much? Please tell me. Because they killed Christ. So it's very interesting that when the disciples are putatively executed, that's because they're so great and wonderful, and we should love them and be inspired by their death. The death of the followers of Jesus demonstrates the truthfulness of Christianity, whereas the death and suffering of Jews somehow shows the wrongfulness of Judaism. I hope you got that. And those of you who are or were ever Christians, no, I'm not making this up. Those of you who ever been in the church know that I am not strawmanning this. I'm not inventing this. Why is there these unequal weights and measurements? That's what I want to know. Why is it that the death and suffering of Christian followers of Jesus demonstrates the truthfulness of the cross, but the death and suffering of Jews at the hands of Christians, which is the ultimate mind-blowing chutzpah, that demonstrates the wrongfulness of Judaism? I rest my case.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא ואת נעשה בחפצו כל אזי מלך שמו נקרא ואחרי ככלות הכל לבדו ימלוך נורא